He was insulted by the girl he loved for being overweight and unattractive. 3 years later, he did something shocking to get revenge. You won't believe what happened. 3 years after they graduated high school, a reunion was organized. When Henry arrived, he stepped out of a shiny, expensive car. He looked nothing like the boy they used to tease. His friend Emily, the only person who supported him during school, was with him. Both of them looked amazing. As Henry got out of the car, people gasped in surprise. Whispers spread through the crowd. "Is that Henry?" they asked, stunned. Henry walked confidently into the hall, and everyone turned to look at him. He scanned the room, searching for Sophia, the girl who had humiliated him years ago. But she wasn't there. At the end of the party, Henry stood up and asked calmly but firmly, "Where is Sophia?" The room went silent. People avoided his gaze, their guilt over how they had treated him weighing them down. Finally, Jenny, one of Sophia's old friends, spoke hesitantly. She couldn't make it," Jenny said nervously. Henry's eyes narrowed. "Why not?" he asked, his voice sharper. Jenny looked frightened and replied softly, "Sophia is staying in the village with her grandmother." The crowd murmured in shock. "Sophia, the billionaire's daughter, living in a village?" someone asked. "Wasn't she supposed to be studying at Oxford? Or Harvard?" another person whispered. Henry's heart began to beat faster as he tried to make sense of it all. "That's not right. Take me to her village," Henry said firmly, his voice filled with determination. Jenny didn't hesitate and quickly agreed. Henry, Emily, and Jenny got into the car. The rest of their classmates, curious about what Henry was going to do, followed behind. Some drove their own cars, while others crowded into a bus. Everyone was wondering why Sophia, the once proud and popular girl, hadn't come to the reunion. As they drove toward the village, the air was heavy with tension. What had happened to Sophia? What was Henry planning to do when he finally saw her? No one had any answers. The road ahead seemed endless, full of mystery and suspense. They drove through a dense forest on a narrow, quiet road. The tall trees cast eerie shadows that danced on the ground as they passed. The atmosphere felt strange, but no one spoke. Everyone was lost in thought, questioning why Sophia, who had once been so wealthy and confident, was now living in such a far-off place. Eventually, they arrived at a small, poor village. The houses were basic, made of wood and mud. It was hard to believe this was where the daughter of a billionaire was living. They went straight to Sophia's grandmother's house, which was tiny and worn down. The walls were cracked and the roof looked old and fragile. When they got there, the door was locked. Henry knocked on the door, but no one answered. They looked around and saw a neighbor nearby. "We're looking for Sophia," Henry said. The neighbor squinted at them, confused. "Who are you?" "We're her classmates," Emily replied when the neighbor asked who they were. The neighbor paused for a moment, then sighed. "Sophia isn't here. She's at the church. Today is her wedding." Everyone froze. Sophia was getting married? Henry's heart started racing. "Can you show us the way to the church?" he asked, trying to keep his emotions in check. The neighbor nodded and gave them directions. Without wasting any time, they all rushed back to their cars and headed to the church. The small village church looked old and worn. Its windows were broken, and the walls were faded. As they walked inside, the air felt heavy with tension. The room was quiet, filled with just a few villagers. At the front of the church stood Sophia, wearing a simple wedding dress. But something was off. Standing next to her was an old man, much older than anyone had expected. His face was wrinkled, and he seemed far too old to be her groom. Sophia was holding a ring, ready to marry him. Then she turned her head and saw Henry walking into the church with his classmates behind him. Her breath caught. She froze. Henry looked completely different, strong, confident, and incredibly handsome. Nothing like the boy she had mocked years ago. Her hands began to tremble, and the ring slipped from her fingers, falling to the ground. The entire room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at Sophia, but she stood frozen in place. Her face turned pale as a wave of shame washed over her. She felt small, trapped in that moment. Tears welled up in her eyes as guilt and regret overwhelmed her. Sophia couldn't bring herself to face Henry. The shame was too much to handle. Without saying a word, she turned and ran out of the church, her wedding dress trailing behind her. The villagers gasped in surprise. Henry stood motionless, silently watching her leave. Meanwhile, the classmates whispered among themselves, unsure of what would happen next. Everyone in the church was stunned. Even the old man who was supposed to marry Sophia and the priest conducting the ceremony. "What's going on?" they murmured, confusion spreading through the room. Outside, Sophia's heart raced as she ran. Her face burned with shame, and her thoughts were spinning. How did they get here? She wondered, overwhelmed by the situation. She had never imagined her life would take such a turn, from being a proud billionaire's daughter to this. Suddenly, Emily ran after her, determined to stop her.
Hey!
"Stop, Sophia!" Emily shouted as she approached the back of the church. Sophia finally came to a halt, her face flushed and tears streaming down her cheeks. Tears streamed down Sophia's face as she turned to Emily, her eyes filled with sadness. "How did you all find me?" she asked, her voice breaking. She couldn't hold it in any longer. Overwhelmed by guilt and regret, she sank to the ground, sobbing. Memories flooded her mind. How she had treated Emily and her mother so cruelly. How she had stolen a necklace and falsely accused Emily's mom when they worked in her mansion. And how she had bullied Henry and their classmates. Now she wished she could turn back time and undo all the terrible things she had done. Emily knelt beside her, her heart heavy. "What happened, Sophia?" she asked gently, her voice filled with concern. "I knew your parents disowned you, but I never imagined things had gotten this bad." Just then, Henry walked up, his footsteps slow and steady. His presence made Sophia's heart sink even lower. She could barely bring herself to look at him. Of all the people she had wronged, Henry had the most reason to despise her. Yet as he stood there in silence, his face unreadable, she felt nothing but shame. Tears continued to roll down her cheeks as she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for everything I did to you and Emily." Henry remained quiet, his expression impossible to read. The silence was unbearable, making Sophia feel even smaller. She wondered if he would ever forgive her. Emily, still by her side, looked deeply into Sophia's tear-filled eyes. Emily's brows furrowed in confusion. "But why were you marrying that old man?" she asked softly, her voice filled with curiosity. "There has to be more to this." Sophia wiped at her tears, her voice trembling as she began to explain. "After Mr. Michael and his wife kicked me out, I had nowhere to go. They weren't my real parents, you know. My mom, she worked as a housemaid in their home. She got pregnant, and the man who got her pregnant disappeared. He never came back." Emily listened closely, her heart aching as she pictured little Sophia growing up without a father. "When I was just 3 years old, my mom died from sickness. I barely remember her," Sophia continued, her eyes drifting far away, lost in memory. "Mr. Michael and his wife felt sorry for me. They adopted me and gave me everything, a home, an education, a life most girls could only dream of. But I don't know why I kept pushing them away. I was angry, and I didn't know how to stop. I hurt them over and over." Tears streamed down Sophia's face as she buried her head in her hands. "One day, they couldn't take it anymore. I was sent away. I lost everything." Emily, feeling the weight of Sophia's pain, gently placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Sophia," she whispered, unsure of what else to say. Sophia sniffled and looked up, her voice shaky. "When I came back to the village, I thought someone might help me, but nobody did. Everyone turned their backs on me. I had no friends, no money, nothing. Her voice cracked as she recalled the loneliness, the desperation. Then she took a deep breath, preparing to reveal the worst part. And then, the worst thing happened. Emily's eyes widened. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The company that rented me the car, I crashed on prom night. They found me," Sophia said, her voice breaking. "They arrested me. They said I had to pay for the damages, but I had nothing." She swallowed hard, the fear evident in her eyes. "My grandma, she's the only one I had left. She was the only one who tried to help, but she didn't have enough money either. Still, she did everything she could." The group of classmates standing nearby exchanged uneasy glances, still in shock at how much Sophia had been through. Even Henry, whose expression had remained stern, seemed to soften, though he stayed silent. Sophia took a shaky breath and continued. "Grandma borrowed money from an old farmer. She thought it would help us pay off the car company, but it wasn't enough. And now he's forcing me to marry him," Emily gasped. "What? He's forcing you to marry him?" Sophia nodded slowly, her entire body trembling. "He said if I don't marry him, he'll make sure I go back to jail. I have no choice." She wiped her tear-soaked face, but the tears wouldn't stop. "I tried everything to pay him back, but nothing worked. So I agreed to marry him." Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps shattered the tense moment. A deep, angry voice roared through the air. "There you are, girl!" Everyone turned. The old farmer stood at the edge of the gathering, his face twisted with fury. His eyes burned as he glared at Sophia. "What are you doing here, wasting time?" he shouted. "You promised to marry me today, and I'm not waiting any longer." Sophia flinched. Her whole body trembled as the man stomped closer, his rough, calloused finger pointing straight at her. "If you don't marry me right now," he growled, "I'll have you thrown back in jail. Do you hear me? Come back to the altar now." His voice echoed through the air, demanding obedience. Sophia stood frozen, tears still streaking her face. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, Henry stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm. "How much is the debt?" The old farmer crossed his arms, eyes narrowing with suspicion. "It's $115,000, he grumbled, fully expecting that no one could afford such an amount. Without hesitation, Henry pulled out his phone. "Give me your bank details," he said coolly. The old farmer hesitated, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. But when Henry remained firm, he reluctantly gave him the account number. Without another word, Henry tapped on his phone. The transaction was done in seconds. A moment later, the farmer's phone beeped. He glanced down, his face shifting from shock to disbelief. "Your debt. It's paid," he muttered, almost unable to believe it himself. "You're free." The entire crowd fell into stunned silence. Sophia's classmates stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Henry, the same boy who had been mocked and humiliated by Sophia, had just saved her from a fate she had no way out of. It was as if the world had turned upside down. Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes, this time not from fear, but from something else. "Thank you, Henry," she whispered, her voice trembling with both shame and gratitude. But Henry's face remained unreadable. "Don't thank me yet," he said coolly. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. "You'll pay me back that money," Henry continued, his voice calm but firm. But in a different way. Her breath caught in her throat. "You'll work as a cleaner in my house for 10 months. Sophia's mouth fell slightly open. She couldn't tell if she was shocked, embarrassed, or relieved. Henry pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket and tossed it at her feet. "You start next week," he said simply. Before she could respond, he turned on his heel and walked away. The other classmates, still in shock, silently followed him as he got into his car and drove off. Sophia stood there, her emotions tangled in knots. Humiliation burned inside her, standing alone outside the church after everything that had happened. But at the same time, relief. At least she was free. Free from the old farmer. free from the weight of that impossible debt. She glanced down at the crumpled piece of paper with Henry's address. With a deep sigh, she wiped the last of her tears, staring down the empty road where the cars had disappeared. For the first time in a long time, she felt something unexpected. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different now. 1 week later, Sophia packed her bags. As she climbed into the car that would take her to Henry's house, an unfamiliar nervousness settled in her chest. She had never felt like this before. With every mile that passed, memories of high school flooded her mind. The Henry she used to know, the boy she had laughed at. Sophia swallowed hard as the car rolled to a stop. She had prepared herself for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the sight in front of her. Henry's house was massive. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Tall gates, a breathtaking garden with perfectly trimmed flowers, and sleek, expensive cars parked in the driveway. It was a world she had never imagined. Suddenly, she felt small. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out and knocked on the grand front door, her heart pounding in her chest. A moment later, the door swung open, and there he was, Henry, seated on a plush, expensive-looking couch in a luxurious sitting room. The room sparkled. Huge windows flooded the space with sunlight, casting golden hues over the elegant decor. Crystal chandeliers, gleaming marble floors, and art-lined walls made the place feel like something out of a dream. But Sophia wasn't focused on the grandeur of the house. She was focused on Henry. He was no longer the boy she had once laughed at. He had changed. He was strong, confident, and devastatingly handsome. "Good afternoon, Henry," she said softly, her voice betraying her nerves. Henry didn't smile. His piercing gaze met hers, cold and unreadable. "From now on, don't call me Henry," he said flatly. Sophia's breath hitched. "Call me boss." The words hit like a slap. Sophia felt her stomach drop, shame creeping up her spine. She lowered her head. "Yes, boss," she whispered. Just then, a voice interrupted the tension. "Hi, Sophia." "Welcome." Sophia turned to see a beautiful young woman entering the room. Emily, Henry's girlfriend. She was stunning, effortlessly elegant with a warm smile that caught Sophia off guard. "Let me show you to your room," Emily said kindly. Sophia followed in silence, struggling to process everything. This wasn't what she had expected. Emily didn't look at her with judgment or cruelty. Instead, she chatted lightly as they walked through the long hallways, trying to make Sophia feel at ease. Sophia's new room was small, but cozy, neatly arranged, with simple furniture. It was nothing like the lavish space she used to call home, but at least it was comfortable. As Emily left, Sophia sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers clutching the sheets. Her life had completely turned upside down. Once proud, spoiled, and adored by everyone. Now, she was a servant. The next morning, Sophia woke up before dawn, her first day as a cleaner. With a deep breath, she got to work. She scrubbed the floors, polished the glass windows, and dusted every surface until the house gleamed. It was back-breaking labor, and her hands ached from the relentless scrubbing. But she had no choice. As she worked, she could hear laughter coming from another room. Henry and Emily. Their voices, light, happy, carefree, felt like a sharp knife twisting in her chest. Sophia bit her lip and continued scrubbing, forcing herself not to think about it. But it was impossible to ignore how different her life had become. Henry barely acknowledged her presence. Whenever he passed by, his eyes flicked over her as if she were invisible. When he did speak, his words were short, cold, orders, nothing more. Sophia kept her head down and obeyed, but deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The hardest part wasn't the cleaning. It wasn't the endless chores or the exhaustion that left her collapsing into bed each night. It was seeing Henry happy and knowing she had once hurt him. One bright afternoon, Sophia was busy scrubbing the staircase when she heard Henry's voice. He had just arrived home, and he wasn't alone. "Sophia!" his deep voice called. She wiped her hands on her apron, her stomach twisting. "Yes, boss," she replied, hurrying down the stairs. "Bring us some juice." She quickly poured a glass, making sure not to spill a drop. But as she stepped into the room, ready to serve, her feet froze. Her heart pounded violently in her chest. Sitting on the couch, chatting casually with Henry, was him, her ex-boyfriend, her first love. The boy she had cruelly left just days before prom, telling him he wasn't in her class anymore. At first, he barely recognized her. Then, he squinted, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "Sophia?" he murmured. The glass slipped from her trembling hands, shattering against the floor. Gasps filled the room. Sophia's face flushed with shame. Without thinking, she turned and ran. Henry's loud, mocking laughter echoed behind her. "Come back here, Sophia," he called, amusement lacing his voice. But she didn't stop. Her feet carried her down the hallway, past the stares of house staff, straight into her small room. She slammed the door shut, burying her face in her pillow, and sobbed. Humiliation burned through her veins. She had never felt so small. She knew now. Henry had done this on purpose. He had invited her ex just to remind her of what she used to be, to show her how far she had fallen. Later that evening, after wiping her tear-streaked face, she went to find him. Henry stood in the dimly lit hallway, his back to her. "Henry," she whispered, her voice shaking. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Why are you doing this to me?" Her voice cracked. "Haven't you hurt me enough?" A cruel smirk tugged at his lips. "Don't call me Henry," he said, his tone cold as ice. "Call me boss." Sophia's breath hitched. He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "You're just reaping what you sowed." His words sliced through her, sharper than any blade. And then, without another glance, he walked away, leaving her heartbroken in the silence. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Henry didn't ease up on her, not even a little. Every day was another chore, another demand. She scrubbed floors until her hands ached, polished windows until they gleamed, did laundry, carried heavy buckets of water, cooked meals. No task was too grueling. Even on her birthday, she received nothing. Nothing but another pile of chores. Only Emily, Henry's girlfriend, seemed to care. That evening, she quietly slipped a tiny cupcake onto Sophia's tray. A single candle flickered on top. "Happy birthday," Emily whispered with a kind smile. Tears welled in Sophia's eyes. She forced a small, grateful smile. "Thank you." That night, as she lay in bed, the past haunted her. She thought of her birthdays before, the ones filled with laughter, the ones where her adopted parents surprised her with gifts and took her to the beach. Those days felt like another lifetime. Now, all she had was silence, and the cold, bitter reminder that she had no one left. Love. She longed for it, for the warmth of an embrace, for the feeling of being cherished. But those days were gone. All she had now was this cold, empty life under Henry's control. 10 long months had passed since Sophia first stepped into Henry's house as a servant. Every day she had worked tirelessly, scrubbing, cooking, cleaning, while dreaming of the day she could finally leave and start fresh. Now, that day had arrived. Her heart was a storm of emotions, relief, fear, hope. She was free from the endless work and the cold, piercing stares. But there was a problem. She had nowhere to go. The thought of returning to the small, lonely village she had once called home made her chest tighten, but she had no other choice. With a heavy sigh, Sophia packed her few belongings, carefully folding her worn clothes and placing them into her old, faded bag. She glanced around the tiny room one last time. The walls had been her prison, but they had also been her shelter. So many sleepless nights. So many silent tears. Taking a deep breath, She stepped out and walked toward the living room. Henry sat on the couch, his arm casually draped around Emily. The sight of them together stung in ways she couldn't explain. She hesitated. Then, summoning all her courage, she spoke. "Thank you, Henry," she said softly, keeping her voice steady. "I'm leaving now." Henry looked up. His face was unreadable, surprisingly calm. Emily gave her a small, understanding nod and a kind smile. But Henry? He said nothing. The silence made Sophia uneasy, but she forced herself to move. She turned toward the door, clutching her bag tightly. She was just about to step out when, "Sophia!" Henry's voice stopped her in her tracks. She froze. Slowly, she turned around. His expression was different. Not cruel, not cold. Something else. Something almost gentle. Her heart pounded. "We have a surprise for you," Henry said, his voice unnervingly calm. His dark eyes locked onto hers. Sophia's breath hitched. A surprise? She stood there, frozen, unsure if she should be excited or terrified. Henry nodded toward one of the doors in the room, and then, in a voice laced with mystery, he said, "Come out." The door creaked open. Sophia's breath hitched. Stepping out from the shadows were two people she never thought she'd see again. Her adopted parents. Her heart stopped. Her mouth fell open. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered in disbelief, "Mom? Dad?" For a moment she couldn't move. Then in a rush of pure emotion, she dropped her bag and ran to them, sobbing. She threw her arms around them, holding on as if she would never let go. "I'm so sorry," she cried, her voice breaking between sobs. "I hurt you both. I was so foolish. Please, please forgive me." Guilt and relief crashed over her like a tidal wave, drowning her in emotion. Her mother stroked her hair, her own eyes glistening with tears. "It's okay, Sophia," she whispered gently, her voice filled with love. "You did hurt us, but it's in the past now. We're here. We never stopped missing you." Her father wrapped his strong arms around them both, his expression soft with forgiveness. "We love you, Sophia," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and we're so happy to have you back." Sophia wept in their embrace, overwhelmed by the love she thought she had lost forever. Across the room, Henry stood watching. For once, his usual stern expression was gone. Something had shifted, something softer, almost warm. He cleared his throat, looking away as if trying to hide his emotions. Sophia wiped her tears and turned to him, her heart pounding with disbelief. It was then that she learned the truth. Henry, cold, distant Henry, had gone to her parents himself. He had pleaded with them to forgive her. He had shown them videos of her working hard, proving how much she had changed, even though she had hurt him in the past. He couldn't bear the thought of her returning to a lonely life in that remote village. He wanted better for her, a second chance. Sophia's chest tightened with emotions too big to name. Tears welled up again as she looked at Henry, truly looked at him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to ever repay you." Henry met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, for the first time since she had met him, he smiled. Henry's smile was brief, but it was real. Sophia had never seen him like this before. For months, he had been cold, distant, more of a shadow than a person. But now, standing there, watching her reunite with her family, there was something different about him, something human. She wiped her tears, still overwhelmed. "Why would you do this for me?" Henry exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He seemed uncomfortable, as if emotions were something foreign to him. "Because," he said finally, his voice lower than usual, "I know what it's like to regret." Sophia frowned. "Regret?" Henry looked away, his jaw tightening. "There was someone in my life once, someone I cared about, but I let them go. I never tried to fix things, never asked for forgiveness. And by the time I realized my mistake, it was too late." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Henry had never spoken about his past. "Helping you?" He hesitated, then sighed. It felt like maybe I could make things right in some way. Sophia didn't know what to say. She had spent so long resenting Henry, believing he was just cruel and heartless. But now, standing here, she realized something. Maybe Henry wasn't as heartless as he pretended to be. Maybe he was just broken, just like her. She took a step closer. "Henry, Before she could finish, Emily, who had been silent until now, clapped her hands together with a small, knowing smile. "Well," she said, breaking the tension, "it looks like it's a day of new beginnings." Sophia glanced at her parents, then back at Henry. Maybe Emily was right. This was a new beginning for all of them. Her mother took her hands, squeezing them gently. "Come home, Sophia." Sophia looked back at Henry one last time, and for the first time in 10 long months, she smiled. Second chances, she had been given a fresh start, and as she looked out at the open road, she knew she would make the most of it, say no to bullying and yes to kindness together. We can make a difference if you enjoyed this story. Please subscribe for more inspiring stories, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.